Senator Gazzoni, we're live.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Guy Gazzoni. I'm senator from Howard County, and I'm chair of the Budget and Tax Committee. And today, the committee is going to have a fiscal briefing, and we have three presenters. We have Andy Schoffel from the Board of Revenue Estimates, who will begin. Then we'll have Dave Romans from our Department of Legislative Services. And then finally, we'll have Secretary Brinkley from the Department of Budget and Management. After each of the presentations, I'll give a few minutes for senators to ask questions, and then again at the very end, if there are additional questions. I'm going to jump right into this. Obviously, unique time that we're all facing and we're living through, but our responsibilities as a committee, our oversight of the budget is still a top priority, and I know we all have been thinking about and talking about, and we need to have this public briefing to share this amongst ourselves and and to the public. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and ask Mr. Schoffel to begin his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee. For the record, Andy Schoffel, the Secretary of the Board of Revenue Estimates. And as you all know, we put out new revenue guidance just last week. And it's important to note the difference here. This is guidance as opposed to an official estimate. The board did not vote on these revenues at this time. The term guidance is very important because it underlies the uncertainty that's sitting out in the world that we face today, as you all know quite well at this point. Everything we do in estimating revenues, as you're going to hear from all of the presenters today, is forward-looking and relies on forecasts of uncertainty, but never has the uncertainty been as wide as it is now. If you look at economic scenarios from any economist, you're going to find an extraordinary divergence in their forecasts and their scenarios, because the reality is this thing could go a multitude of ways. Never have we seen the economy shut down, literally shut down, grind to a halt almost overnight, and then face the number of questions that we're facing now. So I'm not going to belabor you with the entire presentation. I'll hit the high points and I think go for questions. I assume that would be the most appropriate manner for this group. And start off with, we used Moody's analytics scenarios. Moody's, as you all hear every year, is headed by Mark Zandi. We respect him tremendously. He's a fantastic economist. He puts out a lot of work to back up his forecasts. His shop brought in a group of epidemiologists onto the payroll and allowed them to work together with the economic forecasters to build some of the epidemiology into the economic models to help understand how the two would react with each other. So we were big fans of that approach. And what they did is they came out with a series of scenarios. We chose two scenarios to model to create basically bands of what we're going to call likely scenarios. And it's important to note that we didn't take Moody's baseline at the time. This was Moody's thoughts around the second or third week of April. We went with a slightly more pessimistic scenario than their baseline, and then a much more pessimistic scenario of their baseline. And right now, it looks like we made the right choice. Already, the unemployment claims are looking much more like the scenarios that we picked as opposed to their baseline at that time. But that, again, just illustrates how rapidly the ground is shifting and how much we're learning very quickly. So again, uncertainty, and we will be revising these estimates or this guidance, probably still calling it guidance, all the way up until September as time goes. So can we go to the next slide? Here you have the likely range of scenarios. I mentioned S2 and S4. You'll see those lines throughout my presentation. S2 being the lighter impact, orange S4 being the worse impact to the economy. And you can see in fiscal 20, we have about a $925 million deficit versus 1.1 billion for the S4. It widens to fiscal 21, the budget that you all just passed, 2.1 billion or 2.6. And then when we get out to FY22, the budget you would traditionally take up next year at 2.6 billion and 4 billion. So tremendous numbers. When you look at it percentage wise, this year it's between 5 and 6%. Next year you get into double digits, between 10.5 and almost 14. And then by fiscal 22, between 13 and 20%. So extraordinary impacts that we see here, but these are extraordinary times. Next slide, please. Unemployment claims. I find this slide to be the best to illustrate how extraordinary the job loss has been. This compares the number of unemployment insurance claims now to prior recessions. You can see through week 8, this doesn't include today's claims, which did fall, and that's pretty good news. That was to be expected. But still a high number at 35,000. Just under 500,000 through last week, the 8th week. During the Great Recession, it took us 74 weeks. It took a year and a half to hit that many in claims. During the early 90s recession, which was particularly bad for Maryland, not only was it a broad-based recession, but it was also the peace dividend. So we saw a contraction in our federal presence, very bad recession for Maryland, almost the same time period, 77 weeks. During the dot-com bubble back in the early 2000s, we never even came close, 18 weeks to get to 117,000. So, you know, this chart really does help, I think show how quickly the onset has been. And I think it helps you relate to those that are in that situation, right? I mean, we're talking about a number of families here that have just been dramatically and quickly impacted by this. And that's going to flow through the broader economy. Next slide. I do want to note that there is some positive here. You saw on the first slide that we had a roughly, let's call it $1 billion impact for fiscal year 20. When we did our initial conference with the comptroller, we did a worst case scenario where we thought it could be 2.8 billion. Driving that 2.8 billion was an immediate and steep reduction in income tax withholding. Withholding is 45% of the entire general fund. It's critical. It underlies everything we do, and it is directly attached to the wage base. So when we see unemployment insurance claims like that, we would expect to see a drop in wages rather quickly, especially as that chart showed with that slant. But we have not seen that. As you can see here, this chart shows several kind of critical milestones. For me personally, right around early to mid-March is when this thing became very real. It was when I started to be able to understand what we were about to confront, or what we were confronting at that time. And I think that's the case for many people and many businesses. And you can see here, this is the year-over-year growth and withholding. We were trending quite nicely before all of this. Now we see a downward trajectory, but we still see growth. And to think that we could send 500,000 Marylanders to the unemployment claims and have wage growth is illogical. It doesn't make sense. And we've spent a lot of time during this estimate trying to understand that. Now, the good news is obviously I don't have a $2.8 billion downfall for fiscal 20. And that is to be taken as good news, but understanding why this is occurring is also important. And we believe there's some timing constraints there where an hour worked, between the time an hour is worked and the time that we receive that withholding is a bit longer than I had thought initially, and that makes some sense. Further, it's not just the hour worked, but it's the employer's decision about how many hours are going to be worked. So there's even a lag there between when the employer makes a decision and when that actual hour is worked. So that perhaps spreads out the time even further. But I think more likely is, you know, employers came into this in a pretty good position. We've had a long economic expansion. Employers' balance sheets have been strong. We've talked quite a bit throughout the entire expansion about all the cash on companies' balance sheets. So it's very likely that companies had a pretty good cash position to weather the early onset here. Related to that is that employers are compassionate people. I've never worked for an employer that was not a compassionate person, and certainly would have liked to have done everything else they could before cutting wages. I don't think cutting labor is the gut reaction of most employers. So it's likely that they're taking other actions before jumping into the wages, the wage cuts. And then of course there are the federal program as well. So the PPP program, getting some money out there. The state and local governments have had some programs. So there has been an attempt to put cash into the system and tie it directly to maintaining payroll. And perhaps, dare I say, these are actually working, at least in the near term. But again, you can see his trajectory here is headed towards negative territory. Some more recent daily data I've seen is that we're turning negative right now. And we do expect in this forecast for the wage base to turn negative for the rest of this fiscal year, between -3% and -6%. So bad, yes, but a far cry from the -22% that I thought was a plausible worst case scenario just a month ago. So this is a mixture of good news here, I think, but of course, I think it does mean that some of the impact is simply delayed, and we're going to see more of it in the coming months. Next slide, please. Getting into what these economic scenarios look like, this is the national GDP, year-over-year change, and it goes all the way back to 2007. So you can see the onset of the Great Recession. And, Great Recession is capitalized, capital G, capital R. That's how it is in the dictionary because it's a once in a lifetime occurrence. Well, here we are 10 years later with S2 scenario is about twice as deep as the Great Recession. S4 is almost 3 times as deep. Okay, extraordinary contractions here. And what makes this unique is of course, this is not a typical recession. Economists, we call them business cycles, right? Where inevitably during an economic upturn or an expansion, monetary policy doesn't get it perfectly right. Businesses start to take risks to make money, and we turn into a bubble. Things are going up, things are great. And then we realize that we've made some errors in allocating that capital, and boom, we turn down. And that's the natural cycle we've been in, especially since the Federal Reserve System was created in the United States. It is the natural arc of the economy. And you can have financial-based recessions, real economy-based recessions. But what we have here is again, to use another economist word, is exogenous. Something completely outside of the system has caused a shock. And that's why this is so different. We have this initial shock, and you can see it on the charts here with the deep fall, a slight rebound as folks come back to work, a slight net rebound. But then the broader, basically this shock, this exogenous shock now causes the recession, the business cycle recession. So that's what you see here is a shock and then a business cycle recession. But the shock makes the recession, the regular business cycle, it really amplifies it and makes it that much worse. Next slide, please. Here is the S2 scenario comparing Maryland to the national. And as you'd expect to see, we are not as deeply impacted as the broader nation. This makes sense. We have the federal presence, which tends to anchor us in many ways. It restricts the amount that we grow during expansion, and it restricts the amount that we fall during a recession. So this is Maryland's strengths coming to bear, certainly right here. And it's just important that you all know that that is recognized throughout our forecast, even as we use an outside group's economic outlook. Moving on to the next slide to CS4. There you go. Same scenario. The US GDP is much worse than the Maryland, though both are obviously still bad. I do want to say this in the prior chart, these are indexed to the prior peak. In this case, the prior peak will be the fourth quarter of 2019. This helps you to see how far we fall in some of these. And I'm going to jump to the next slide to show you the difference in the scenarios. I think this helps to compare. This is that same indexing of the S2 and S4. You can see that S2, we hit a trowel in this quarter. Okay, 2020 Q2 right now is the worst of it. And that makes sense. We've shut down the economy. We have ground to a halt. We have put 500,000 people to go seek unemployment insurance. -8% is the loss in our economic activity, okay, peak to trough. On the S4 scenario, it is almost 12%, and it's a year out from now. So you can start to see there's a lot of discussion in the papers now about the shapes of the recovery. There's the four most popular. There's the V. That seems to be what the stock market is banking on to some degree. It's not what we see. It's basically that we have this horrible second quarter that we're in right now, but we bounce right back and things get back to normal. Yeah, there's a little bit of a period where we grow slowly, but it's a pretty quick return to the prior normal. And you see that here, or you don't see that here rather, I'm sorry. What we have in S2 is what you could describe as either a W or a U. The U shape is the way I look at it, where you fall and you're down for a bit, and then you start to expand several quarters later. You could argue it's a W simply because there's that slight bounce back I mentioned in the third quarter, and then it kind of slows again before expanding. S4 to me looks like the swoosh. We've heard about the Nike swoosh. This is where you have that sort of deep dive that actually rounds out at the bottom as the recession really hits over quite a long period of time. Again, here, it takes a year before we hit the bottom. And then you start to see the trajectory turn up as we have a slow recovery. It's important to note some of the differences in the assumptions underlying these. First off, they both assume that there is a vaccine available widely, not just available, but widely dispersed and consumed by the fall of next year. Okay, by the fall of next year, there is a vaccine. S2 assumes that we can continue to get some stimulus from the federal government. S4 assumes that we cannot, or that what we get is simply not enough to make a difference. And that sure seems to be the talking points that we're reading out of DC right now. I continue to hope that that is all negotiation strategy, and that we will see another pot of money going to state and local governments. It would be a terrible, it's a squandered opportunity for the federal government to not send money to backfill state and local coffers for us to maintain an employment. It is something that they can directly affect. State and local payrolls are obviously significant in Maryland, but are significant in every state and every county around the country. And this is one of those few opportunities the government has to directly interject and help prevent a further downfall. So that is something I really hope that they get their acts together and can get some money out to us to help us not see that orange line, but see something closer to the blue line. But that's obviously not a given right now. It's not a given right now, not by any stretch. And then underlying that are various assumptions about how long some of the unemployment lasts, and you can see that in these curves. But I think looking at some of those assumptions that are more policy related there, the vaccine as well as the government stimulus, those are two major differences. They both do assume that there's a pickup of cases in the third quarter, in the fall, as folks get back to work. But neither assumes another shutdown of activity like we saw, another stay-at-home order. So neither of these scenarios assumes another stay-at-home order, but they do assume a pickup in cases. Moving on to the next slide. This is where the rubber hits the road. It's all about employment. I mentioned wage growth and withholding earlier. Obviously, employment directly impacts that. It's the most important barometer to economic numbers, as well as just individual happiness. People need to work to be happy. It's the reality. Again, going back to the Great Recession, these are levels here. We lost 123,000 jobs over the course of 2 years. Everybody on this call remembers how horrible the Great Recession was, and the very difficult decisions that had to be made by employers and by many of you that were on this committee during that time. Now you see these two scenarios that are deeper and quicker. I've got the levels here in that table that's here just to really put this into context. You know, between the two scenarios, a job loss of between 250,000 and 340 in this initial quarter. All right. Again, you see that slight bounce back, but then the recessionary job losses really hit, the more long-term job losses hit and continue to hit for a period of time, and then the slow recovery. In this chart, we never get back to the prior forecast. I would have to go out about 10 years for us to get back to that prior level of employment. We know we had a very extraordinary employment environment leading into this. We know we were in the peak of a bubble because of that level of employment. History tells us that. So perhaps we shouldn't get back to that level of employment theoretically. But nonetheless, that's an important milestone. You can see that in S2, we start to get back to the prior peak employment all the way out at the end of 2024. So even in our more, if you want to call it optimistic scenario, the blue line there, it's not until really late 2024, early 2025, where you get back to even the pre-recession level of employment. So it's a really tough read on the economy here. These aren't just numbers, these are families, these are households. And it's going to translate to all of you as the extraordinary revenue impact that we've shown you so far. So everybody is going to have some real tough decisions to make over the next several years. Next slide. This just shows you where it hits. This is the blue is the personal income tax. The income tax itself is 50% of the general funds, so naturally it bears the brunt of the impact. It has the wage impact. We do see the non-wage impact as being extraordinary as well. We're expecting estimated payments, basically the income that comes from business owners especially, to fall between 50 and 75% in the first and second quarter of this year. There's a chance it could be zero. How many businesses are seeing profits in their forecast for this year, right? Just losing a month or two of business can be enough to wipe out the whole year's profits, period. So, you know, it could be that scenario is actually somewhat rosy. The sales tax is immediately and directly affected. Other states are seeing worse sales tax impacts, but that's likely because lessened sales tax impacts. And that's because they tend to tax perhaps grocery at home or even medicine, two things that we don't. I like that as a policy choice. It reduces the regressivity of the sales tax, but it does mean that our sales tax is harder hit right now because our sales tax is a little more focused on discretionary purchases, which are much more so impacted. So we have a big impact of the sales tax. Sales tax is 25% of the general funds. You see it here in a big way. I will note, we've only seen 1 month of real data for the sales tax. That is the month of March. Okay, so March, which is kind of half impacted by the stay-at-home order, that fell pretty much like we expected it to. It was down around 30%. If you were to double that and say that's what a full month of a shut-in would look like, that's about 60%. That's about what we were thinking. It's also worth noting that the online ordering is holding up. So we do track that for our own purposes, but also because anything over 100 million goes into the Kerwin Focused Blueprint Fund. As you'd expect, a lot of the retail activity is transitioning over to the online, so that source has held up so far. In the outlook, we did bring down the forecast of that marginally, simply because incomes will be constrained. But of course, now is a good time to talk about some of the dynamic shifts in the economy that might occur. Brick and mortar has seen their sales cannibalized by online retailers for the last 2 decades. This is likely to quicken that. Folks are going to start buying things online now that perhaps they didn't. The online grocery business is going to blow up. That's going to continue, blow up in a good way, right? Expanding. And it's going to continue to do so at a more rapid clip. You know, everybody's talking about office space. That's a logical consideration. I worry considerably about the city of Baltimore and office space. Office space is going to be under pressure. It was under pressure before because of teleworking. I think that's been an ongoing source of discussion in the financial community about whether or not they would have been able to refinance all of the commercial property debt all throughout the 2000s and the 2010s. Now we're going to be back in that same discussion. The value of those properties is likely declining, and they're going to need to refinance those loans. You know, we're going to be talking about a different economy in 5 years and in 10 years. Some of it's going to be just a quickening of things that were already in place, that were already occurring. We're going to see a shift to more AI and more robotics, right? Things that can keep working when people aren't needed. That was already happening. That's going to look even cheaper and more attractive now. What does that mean to our wage base? What does that mean to our unskilled workers? And the answer is it's not good. It's not good. So there is going to be shifts in the economy that those are just the ones that we can speculate about, right? There's the whole litany of things that none of us can foresee at this point. And some of those might be quite positive. But it is the case, I believe, that especially our unskilled laborers are going to be deeply impacted. And you know, from a policy response perspective, it's a group that I think is going to need some real support going forward. And I would advocate strongly for skills-based training for our adult population in a very broad and meaningful way. To help transition some of those service jobs to skilled jobs, because many of those service jobs are going to transition in the future. That was always the case, but again, more aggressively now. Next slide is the S4 scenario. It's the same picture. It's just bigger numbers. That really concludes my presentation, and I would open it up to questions. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of positive to say. I'm sorry that I very rarely do when I come before you. But I don't want to sugarcoat this, and you all are going to have some really tough decisions, but we'll be there to help you through them. So thank you.
So first off, Mr. Schaffel, obviously thank you for all the work that you've done through this, but over the years. We really appreciate everything you've done, your detail and honesty and straightforwardness. We really appreciate. So any quick questions from members before we go on to the next presentation? Anybody want to raise your hand? Senator Rosapap.
Yeah, thank you. That really was a terrific presentation and very helpful. Do the macro projections you're getting from the economic projection firm, what do they say about international trade? What do they say about the relationship with demand and trade with Europe and with China, as well as just international travel, which travel is a big deal for the Maryland economy at the port and planes and trains, whatever, not trains, international travel. You understand what I'm saying? Can you give us any sense of where the international piece fits into it?
You know, I didn't look at the travel metrics. I don't even know if they forecast some of the travel metrics. That might be a little bit too micro for what they do. But they did have a slowdown in international trade broadly. It's hard to look at trade at the state level. The national level is where that would really show up in a macro outlook. And they do have international trade slowing for quite some time. And part of that is this was initially a bit of a supply shock because we consume so much from overseas in terms of the inputs that we then create outputs in the United States. And so there was already a supply shock, but the Moody's forecast does see a slowing in international trade in both of their scenarios. I'll send you exactly what those numbers are.
Great.
It doesn't quite get into that level of detail, right? Like we know we bring a lot of folks in to learn and to work here that create a tremendous economic impact. I don't think you're going to see that in the numbers directly, but you'll see it at a national level, a reduced level of international trade.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Senator Alfred.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Schaffel. This has been enlightening. You mentioned before a policy recommendation and investing in skills-based learning. And I'm curious if you have any other kind of quick hits policy recommendations that we should spend the next 6 months thinking about before we go back into session.
Sure. I think the only other one that really sticks out to me, and I'll be giving this a lot of thought. You'll see some more from me after this about that. The skills-based training, I think, is the key, and I think that helps you. I know Kerwin is important to you all. I've always been a fan of the adult learning for skills-based training because I think it does help the kids, and you get an immediate return on your investment. You might, obviously you spend a lot of money building the training infrastructure, but as you take folks that tend to consume resources and turn them into people that are actually adding to the tax rolls, you not only get that new tax, but you're also creating, a less on the downside. So it gives you more money to do some of these programs, these other programs. There's a real return on investment there. But to your point, another policy, I think this goes nationally as well. Too much of our tax strategy is tied to wage earners, whereas much more of the economy is shifting to capital. And, every time you put a tax on something, you make it more expensive, which means you get less of it. And to the extent that we could focus more of our tax structure, shift it more from labor to maybe value added or production, I think that is a better measure of economic activity now. So probably a better measure, a better way to collect taxes. Therefore, you could look at how many entities that are out there that have zero labor, but produce a lot of added income. Companies for myriad reasons have, any one company has hundreds of entities, legal entities, and some of those legal entities have zero payroll, but add tremendous value because they own trademarks or whatever, and they pay an income tax on that, and they do. But it seems that over time, we keep shifting more and more of the policy burden, the tax policy burden, on the wage earners, while wages seem to be making up less of the economic activity. And I don't think that's a lasting solution. And it might be time to revisit that. Speaking for myself here, of course, I'm not speaking for the Board of Revenue Estimates, not for the Comptroller of Maryland.
Thank you very much.
Purely citizen Andy Schoffel. Sure.
Senator Griffith.
I think I just got muted again. Okay. I just had a quick question. We've been talking about the Great Recession as we've walked through your presentation, and I may have missed it, but I'm curious as to whether or not there's been anyone looking at residential real estate and the potential impact. We all, talk about and anticipate the impacts on commercial real estate, but I know during the last recession, so much of it was based on residential. Do you have any projections as it pertains to that?
We do. They're not included here. It's one of the odd intricacies of Maryland, right? Our general fund is not really directly impacted by real estate. It is obviously for the annuity bond fund. It does impact individual Marylanders in a significant way. It impacts counties in a huge way.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
I don't have those forecasts here. I can tell you that there is even a wider divergence in Moody's scenarios for real estate than there is for the economy here. So I think they're very uncertain about how the real estate market is going to play out through this, even more so than they are everything else. We'll send that along this week. Early next week, we'll be putting out a new forecast for the transfer tax, which is impacted by this, and the forecast for residential real estate will accompany that. But there's a lot of scenarios to see there, right? We're going to be in a low interest rate environment here for a little while, but we're going to be cash constrained. So far, it looks like prices are holding up, but the supply side is down on the sales side. I think we've hit probably the lowest inventory on record. And it looks like the sellers that are currently in the market aren't budging on price. That will give with time. I would expect a downturn in prices and a downturn in volume. So there is going to be certainly you can't have this kind of a recession without a deep impact. But the scope of that impact right now, the outlook is quite wide, and I'll send that along to you.
Great, thanks so much.
Sure.
Okay, I think I don't see any more hand raised, so I'm going to move on to the next presentation. So Mr. Romans, who is with the Department of Legislative Services. Mr. Romans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So our document is going to try to kind of pick up where Andy left off, walk you through sort of on the fiscal side, what's changed since session ended, and sort of show you sort of a picture of what you are looking at the next couple of years in terms of the budget challenge and some of the things that might need to be done to address it. We can go to the next slide. All right, so just to remind you where things stood at the end of session. For fiscal 20, you left a 346 million general fund balance. Fiscal 21, a 324 million general fund balance. This is one of the larger fund balances we've had at the end of a legislative session in many years. These numbers take into account both your actions on the budget as well as all of the legislation that was passed during the session. In addition, you had a rainy day fund balance of about 6%, 1.1 billion. You did authorize the governor to use up to 150 million of that to respond to COVID-19. He initially indicated after session that he intended to use that money. As I'll talk about a little bit later, with some of the federal money that we've gotten, it may not be necessary to use that 150 million for COVID-19, as the federal dollars will likely pay for those same costs. Next slide. Thanks. So there's really three impacts that COVID-19 has had on our fiscal outlook. The first, as Mr. Schoffel talked about, is our general fund revenues obviously are coming in a lot lower than we expected. But there's also other revenue impacts. With the casinos being closed, the Education Trust Fund is going to take in substantially less money in the current fiscal year. If they're closed through June, about 165 million less than was expected. And that money was budgeted to fund our education aid in the current year. So we need to find ways to backfill for that. The Transportation Secretary testified in the House yesterday that we're going to come up about 500 million short in Transportation Trust Fund revenues in the current fiscal year, and similar magnitude in fiscal 21. And the University System of Maryland is looking at over $200 million revenue impact in the current fiscal year. So really all of the different places where the state takes in money are all seeing significant revenue losses. The second area is obviously that there's a lot of costs associated with responding to COVID-19, most specifically in the health area, the public health response, but also things like small business assistance and enhanced pay for some of the essential state workers, overtime costs for state workers, IT costs as we're doing more teleworking across the state. So quite a significant amount of costs being incurred in the current year to respond. I mean, we had some initial numbers from DBM that showed we'd entered into emergency contracts in excess of 300 million through the end of April, just to give you a sense of the kind of costs. That's just the contracts, not the state employee costs and so forth. The other big area of expense that's going to come, I think, slowly, but it's going to start impacting us more in fiscal 21, is we're starting to see growth in our entitlement caseloads. Just like you saw with unemployment insurance, people are turning to these programs for assistance. Can we go to the next slide and I'll show you some data on that? Next slide. So this is temporary cash assistance caseloads, and it's comparing the trends to the same month in the prior year. The line is the number of recipients each month from July 14 through April of this year. And the bars show you the change from the same month in the prior year. You can see until March, we had been seeing kind of, a steady decline in our cash assistance caseload. It bounces around a little bit month to month, but a downward trend. And we were down to a little under 40,000 people by February. We saw a little bit of a spike for the first time in the period in March. And then in April, you can see we added more than 11,000 people to the rolls. That's a 30% increase over April of the prior year. So that's the most dramatic growth we've seen at any time in this period, and really the most dramatic 1 month growth I think we've seen in decades. All right, next slide. This shows you the Medicaid caseload trends. The line is the percentage change over the same month in the prior year. The bars are the actual number of additional recipients versus the same month in the prior year. And Medicaid was already growing up a little bit versus the prior year because we've done more and more to try to make it easy to enroll in Medicaid, including the easy enrollment process and people can, in their tax returns, ask to see if they're eligible for the health exchange or Medicaid. But again, you'll see in April, we saw a significant spike, not quite like temporary cash assistance, but a spike nonetheless in Medicaid. So we are starting to see these upward pressures on the entitlement programs. Next slide. All right, so a little bit of good news is there is a lot of federal money, primarily through the CARES Act, coming to help us. As we'll see in a moment, about $6 billion of money coming either to state government or directly to institutions like the hospitals and higher education institutions. This figure, the $6 billion, does not include the Paycheck Protection Program, which is roughly $10 billion that's come to Maryland. And it doesn't include a lot of direct assistance programs like unemployment insurance, enhanced supplemental nutrition assistance benefits, and the $1,200 per adult that the federal government is sending to taxpayers. The challenge with this money is, for the most part, it's targeted to very specific programs or can only be used to cover those additional costs associated with COVID-19, which is certainly very helpful to the state, but it is not, for the most part, eligible to be used to backfill revenue losses. So it helps on the one side of the equation with those new costs, but not for the most part with our revenue decline. On the general fund side, the one area that's kind of different than that is Medicaid. The federal government has temporarily raised the federal match on Medicaid, Maryland going from 50 to 56.2%, at least through June. So that's about $275 million in fiscal 20 that we'll receive, that essentially substitutes for general funds. So that will give us some relief. Next slide. So this shows you the kind of accounting or the detail for the $6 billion I mentioned in the prior slide. A lot of the small programs are existing programs that were enhanced. I'm just going to talk about a couple at the top of the chart. The Coronavirus Relief Fund is the biggest pot of money, and this is coming to the state and to local governments. 2.3 billion, about 700 million went directly from the federal government to our 5 largest jurisdictions, Baltimore City and the 4 big counties. And those counties have all received their money. The governor has indicated that another, and has actually moved forward with this, another 300 million will go out to the other 19 counties, using the same allocation methodology that was used to come up with the money for the 5 big jurisdictions. So that leaves $1.3 billion for state costs. The federal rules on the Coronavirus Relief Fund are really, you can use it for anything related to the response to the virus, but you're not supposed to backfill revenue losses. There appears to be a little bit of wiggle room in the guidance they've produced lately, sort of suggesting that a lot of public safety and public health personnel costs since the virus arrived can be funded with this money and essentially be substituting for general funds. So there may be some opportunities to get some general fund relief, but most of this will pay for the additional costs. The second big pot of money is going directly from the federal government to the hospitals and other medical providers. The feds still have quite a bit of money to release, so that number is going to grow, but they have not yet allocated it out. There's a disaster relief fund that provides about $800 million to state and local governments in Maryland. There is a local and state match for this, about 25%. However, it appears they're going to let us use the coronavirus relief funds as part of that match. So this is, again, money that can be used to respond to the virus and the costs associated with it. MDOT and WMATA will get quite a bit of money through these transit grants. And the transit grants can actually be used to offset revenue losses. So that will help the Transit Administration and WMATA offset their lost revenues. And then I already talked about the Medicaid, $275 million. That Medicaid enhanced match could continue into the next fiscal year. It's in effect the enhanced federal match until the federal emergency declaration ends. But I mean, it's hard to predict what the president will do in terms of that declaration, but we're good at least through June in terms of the enhanced federal money. So those are sort of the big pots of money coming from the federal government. So you can see there's a lot of other pots, including some money going directly to local education agencies and to higher education institutions. Next slide. All right, so the next couple of slides, we want to talk about sort of how things are changing due to various actions that happened since session ended. So this chart, the blue bars show you the budget outlook, the DLS forecast at the end of session. So just took into account the legislation that was passed and the budget actions. And it's on a cash basis, not a structural basis. As you can see in fiscal 20 and 21, we had a positive fund balance. And then things got a little bit worse each year, getting over 1.5 billion in cash problems by fiscal 25, or actually by fiscal 24. Now, the gray bars show you what the outlook looks like when you take into account the vetoes that the governor did. No impact at all in fiscal 20. In fiscal 21, the vetoes actually make the situation worse because he vetoed the tobacco tax increase that would have generated 100 million of revenue for the general fund. And there really were no bills that were vetoed that would have increased costs in fiscal 21. So it leaves us in a little bit weaker position in fiscal 21. The vetoes have a very marginal positive impact on the fiscal outlook in 22 and 23. Now, what's shown here is they have quite a significant impact in 24 and 25. That's primarily because there were Kerwin general fund costs being forecast in 24 and 25 that go away. I would note, though, that we at DLS did not score any revenue from the digital advertising tax in our forecast. That's if it actually comes to pass and the courts don't intervene, that would generate about 250 million a year that would help kind of reduce those Kerwin costs. So we probably are overstating the benefits of the veto somewhat in 24 and 25 to the extent that that digital advertising money would be real by that point. Next slide. All right, so slide 8 here just shows you those same bars, just on a different scale. And then we've layered in the S2 and S4 forecasts that Mr. Schaffel presented. And we embedded in those also DLS's forecasts of how entitlement costs are going to grow because of COVID-19. So the red line is the S2 scenario. The black line is the S4. Again, this is on a general fund cash basis. And you can see it's pretty staggering. By fiscal 22, under the better case scenario, we're at nearly a $4 billion general fund cash deficit. We're talking about 20% essentially of our general fund revenues at that point that we need to solve. And then it slowly gets gets a little bit better after that. But a very bleak scenario in the out years, certainly. Obviously it remains to be seen whether the revenue estimates are, high, low, or somewhere in between. But it gives you kind of a picture on a cash basis. Next slide. All right, so the administration began to respond on the fiscal side to the budget hole for fiscal 20 yesterday at the Board of Public Works. They took 121 million of general fund reductions that the board approved. These are all fiscal 20 reductions. The biggest item is 62 million. This is money that in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, the General Assembly was transferring from the dedicated purpose account in fiscal 20 to the annuity bond fund to help pay debt service costs in fiscal 21. The administration is cutting that money. And what they're saying is that they expect bond premiums will be adequate to fully fund the annuity bond fund. And certainly the March bond sale, we had a very strong bond premium. If that environment continues in the fall, then this seems like it's probably a reasonable estimate. But it is certainly uncertain, how the bond markets are going to respond as the economy continues to struggle. All right, the second big item is WMATA. So this is 35 million of the state's payment to WMATA. The state was withholding this money pending an audit from WMATA. And the audit was not expected to be completed until after the fiscal year ended. So the 35 million is it's a little bit unclear whether they expect to eventually pay this in a future fiscal year to Armada, or these costs will never be paid. Then there are quite a few pay-go related items. The biggest, 7.6 million, related to school safety grants. $10 million was budgeted in fiscal 20 for capital school safety related activity. Apparently only 2.4 million has actually gone out already. So this cuts the rest of the money. The historic revitalization tax credit was budgeted at $9 million. This takes 7 million of it. Now the logic here is that each year we budget for this tax credit, we put the money in a reserve account, and then we reimburse the state general fund when the developers actually claim the credits. The credits are often claimed many years after the money was budgeted. So the thought here is we have a lot of cash to pay the immediate costs. So this is sort of just assuming that, we'll true up the reserve fund at a future point in time. So it's sort of a cash flow cut. Baltimore Regional Neighborhood Initiative is another pay-go item. Governor is cutting $4.2 billion, or $4.2 million, sorry. Still leaving quite a bit of money for that project and those activities, but this means less activity. As we understand it, no one who had signed an agreement for the money is getting cut, but there may be people who thought they had an agreement that they had not yet signed that will not get funding. Community college facilities renewal. This leaves 1 million after the cut. This may push some costs, at least temporarily, off onto the counties if they already were moving forward with projects and expected to get some of this money. The enterprise zone tax credit it appears to just be something that was over budgeted. So there's a 1 million cut there. The strategic demolition program gets cut by 800,000. There's still more than 10 million in the budget in fiscal 20 for this program. And then the hazardous substance cleanup program, we're told, was not going to spend this nearly $300,000. So that's the accounting for the 120 million, 21 million of cuts that the governor talked. That's certainly just a first installment of trying to balance the fiscal 20 budget. Next slide. All right, so this is our last slide. What we try to do here is sort of show you sort of the kind of, at a very high level, what kind of decisions they'll need to be made to balance the budget in the current year and the next 2 years. So we start on the chart with the closing balance at the end of session. We show you the impact of the vetoes. We took the mid-range point of Mr. Schaffel's two estimates just to simplify this a little bit. So you can see roughly $1 billion revenue loss in fiscal 20. It grows by about $1 billion a year from there. And then you can see our expectation, the DLS expectation of an entitlement impact, additional costs in fiscal 20 through 22. There's some budget savings that we're already aware of. The Board of Public Works cut in fiscal 20, the enhanced federal Medicaid match that I talked about. And then we get into the balancing options. So in fiscal 20, certainly we could use the rainy day fund, although we don't think you'll need to do that. We think that it's likely that the administration will be able to come up with at least 100 million of cuts out of agencies through savings from the hiring freeze, reduced operating costs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, using some of that coronavirus relief fund to pay for state police and some other expenses that were budgeted with general funds should free up some state money. So we think it's likely they can come up with roughly $100 million there. The other thing that we might suggest is, particularly in Medicaid, we get a lot of bills that we don't, for fiscal 20 costs that don't come in until the next fiscal year, over 200 million. So we would suggest that you could just use fiscal 21 dollars to pay those bills and get a temporary kind of one-time savings in fiscal 20. Now it adds to your challenge in 21, but on a cash flow basis, it saves us some money in fiscal 20. So that would be a path to getting to balance in fiscal 20. In 21, it gets a lot harder. If you look at under those balancing options, we suggest, if you drain the rainy day fund, that would give you about 1.1 billion. And then there's really two other levers to push. One is waiting to see if Congress will actually pass some additional aid, which would certainly greatly help our outlook. And the other obviously is going to be budget reductions and fund balance transfers and so forth, state budget actions. I think one of the challenges the administration has is normally faced with this situation, you would want to cut as much as you can before the start of fiscal 21. One, so you get a full year of savings from whatever programs you're making cuts to. And two, because it gives whoever you're taking money away from time to plan and adjust their spending. The challenge is the longer we have to wait for Congress to decide what to do, how much do you cut now on the state side because you're not sure if Congress is going to help, and how much do you wait to see if they're going to act? So I think hopefully Congress will make some decisions in the next couple of weeks, but otherwise the state's probably got to do some balancing between how aggressively to cut in June and how much to wait and see if Congress is going to provide some relief. And in fiscal 22, it's the same thing. The same two levers are really out there: state budget actions and additional federal aid would be needed. And you can see that that budget gap is in the $4 billion range. So again, that's at a very high level, kind of the way we see the budget looking. I'm sure the secretary will have some thoughts about especially fiscal 20 and how the administration plans to respond. We're happy to answer any questions committee members have.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. Great presentation. Any questions from committee members? Raise your hand. Senator Rosenpath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple of questions. One is back to the $6 billion, more or less the money coming to state and local governments in Maryland under CARES 3. I'm trying to get my head around that in relation to our state budget, but also local budgets. Do we have any sense at this point of how much additional costs the local governments are having and taking on with the crisis, or is that too soon to know?
We don't have much in the way of specifics. Now, I know that DBM has actually asked each local to submit a plan on how they plan to spend the money that they've received. So they may have a little bit more detail. DLS has been working with MACO and talked to the county fiscal officers and asked them to provide some response about what costs they're incurring and how the virus is impacting their revenues and their budgets. So we hope to have something in the very near future that's a little bit more illuminating.
And then on the state money, particularly the 1.3 of unallocated and some of the other things that are less categorical, what sense do we have of what the administration is really spending the money on?
We have not been given a specific accounting. As I did mention, we've seen a list of emergency contracts, mainly related to public health, buying protective equipment, setting up the convention center, getting tests and all of that. That adds up to more than 300 million in emergency contracts. So there's obviously significant costs there. The increased pay to state workers is fairly modest, but will add some costs. And we know that the governor had proposed roughly $140 million of small business assistance. So I think we're aware of probably at least 500 million of costs that we may potentially incur in the current year. I am sure there are other costs going on, but I have not seen a number from the administration yet.
But the ones that you actually have a list that you can send us?
Yeah, I can send you a list of the emergency contracts that the state has entered into. Sure.
That'd be great, just so we get a sense of generally where the money is going. Last question is on the flexible money, what I call the 1.3 billion. It obviously has to be spent on virus-related costs. Do you have any sense from the guidance as to how narrowly or broadly that's defined? And the example that I'm most familiar with talking to people is education. Is clearly it could cover buying laptops for kids who didn't have laptops so they could study at home. But would it be likely to cover the investment for the fall in training teachers to be better able to deliver online? That you may not know the answer to that specific one, but I'm trying to understand how much of it is the absolute, we got to spend this money today, as opposed to we got to get our act together when we go back to school in the fall.
Right. So we have the authority to use that coronavirus relief money, that 1.3 billion, through the end of the calendar year. I think that any sort of distance learning costs would be eligible. I would note the counties have also gotten some of that money, so they too could be providing some of that money to the school systems. Also, it's important to keep in mind the school systems have gotten roughly 180 million directly from the federal government to help them, which should also help them cover at least a portion of those distance learning costs.
And then the related question, I guess, is the economic relief and recovery for businesses. So again, that money was available, as you just said, for some of the state programs to help our small businesses. Do I presume correctly that we assume that it's also available? Let's say we get into a recovery phase, which we all hope we'll get into sooner rather than later. Presumably it'll be available to help, for example, on Andy's point about upskilling folks for the new work environment. Is it obvious or not clear whether that money could be used to help folks get back to work?
I think it's probably in a gray area. It sounds like the federal government wants to be as flexible as they can be, but my personal experience is sometimes the program people want to be flexible and the auditors don't when they come in later. But I think that's kind of in a gray area.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Romans, on that 35 million from WMATA, could the CARES transit dollars be theoretically used for that if once the audit issues are cleared?
Yeah, I don't think there's a reason we couldn't use the CARES transit dollars to support that. So it's certainly a transit related cost.
Okay. All right. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move on to Secretary Brinkley. Mr. Secretary.
Hello. Okay, I just activated the camera and the microphone. So, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's good to be in front of you. However, I know you've all had some experience meeting this way. I've had experience with BPW and a few others, but this is my first time in front of you in a virtual environment. So thank you for the opportunity. I have with me Mark Nicole. Now, he was having some connection issues. I presume that he's able to get in and perhaps be a part of this. Let's hope so anyway. I know he disconnected and then reconnected, so we'll find out in a moment. I appreciate the opportunity and Mr. Chairman for your flexibility and cooperation as we discuss the dates to have this conversation. I do think that today, as opposed to some of the earlier dates that we were discussing, is obviously much more, I guess, productive, for lack of a better word, and workable, just because we did have actions taken yesterday by the Board of Public Works and last week's act. Okay, I apologize for that. Took my screen away and everything else. Because then last week we also had the board revenue estimates. And while Andy is on the phone, I'll point out that he had notified everybody of his retirement earlier, but he's hanging on to help us through this transition. And I truly appreciate it. I know that my team does appreciate it. And so while he's still here, he doesn't like a lot of us to talk about it, but I just want to acknowledge his work and dedication and service. And thank you, Andy, for hanging in here beyond the time when you originally had targeted to go. So in light of the most recent estimates of the impact that we have some challenges ahead of us. And I'm glad that we're able to continue the conversation so that we can just try to figure some of these things out as we go forward. In fact, as recently as just 48 hours ago, and I think 72 hours ago, we got some different facts or some interpretation. Mark might be able to go into it in a little more detail that can help us with what we anticipate coming from the federal government. I'm deviating from my remarks here to point out that Mr. Roman's slide 10, that graphic was very informative, I hope, for you all in the context that until we can wrap our arms around what's coming from the federal government, we're going to have some tough decisions as we deal with 21. Our mission and our strategy at this point in time was to get us to 21, to try to clear up what we can with the FY20 budget. And those were the recommendations that we took to and had adopted yesterday. We then have to see exactly how some of those parameters come through. While it's not an official meeting, the revenue team has conversations weekly so they can see what some of the receipts are. And we're looking forward to see what some of the, Beth, can you do that, please? Thanks. So that we can see what the impacts will be, or at least the receipts as we wrap May up, because that'll be critical to us moving forward to see whether, as Andy had pointed out, that exceptional withholding numbers that came in for April, whether or not they continue moving forward. So we had this check-in last week with the revenue estimates, and the Board of Revenue Estimates projected we could lose from $925 million to $1.1 billion in the current year. Again, their May conversation will help dictate where that goes. And then we have the even costlier revenue losses in line for 21, and then certainly out to 22. We're facing what we hope is a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. Only time will tell, but the BRE update indicates the magnitude and the timing of the stabilization actions that we have to take are going to be big drivers in what we do. We could have as much as a 6% hole punched into the current year, and that's only with an impact that we've had of 3 months. It worsens to more than 13% when we extrapolate it out to a full year in FY21, before potentially reaching 20% in FY22. I also want to, now I made notes on this, but then Andy covered that as it's premised on us having a widespread vaccine by next fall, not this coming fall, but next fall. And we really don't know what's going on. And in my private conversations with those of you that I've spoken with, our mission is to ensure that we just have some flexibility and make sure that we have some resources so that we can be dexterous, so that we can react in areas where we have to react and try to do so quickly. I think we are seeing the fruits of some of the earliest actions now by virtue of the facts that we don't have some of the hospitalizations going up like they were. Theoretically, we flattened the curve. But then any of you who have also done some of the history on the 1918 pandemic will see that the second wave and the third wave, we don't really know what they're going to look like and what impact they're going to have. And it was the second wave in the 1918 flu that was the most destructive and impactful. I'll point out, for those of us that have been around a while, that should we have that worst case scenario in FY22, our general fund revenues will be at the FY 2016 levels, 6 previous fiscal years to that impact. And we've made a lot of changes since then, but that potentially could be the revenue source that we have on that. So when we transition to the administration's response, we all acknowledge that the governor, with his swift and decisive response on the revenue downturn, was to get ahead of this thing as quick as we could. He ordered a budget freeze on non-coronavirus related spending. Some of the questions that Senator Rosa Pep had with, what's going on with some of the contracts and all, we are not holding back on some of the, at least resources allocated in that regard. But keep in mind also that we might have a contract signed, but until we actually receive services or products, nothing goes out the door. And we're all cognizant of the supply chain challenges that we've had. Now, on our morning calls, we're starting to get, well, not starting, where the supply of some of the PPEs and things like that are coming in better at a rate, and production is able to catch up to us. So at that point in time, I'm sure we'll see some more monies going out in that regard. The other thing that the governor did was institute a hiring freeze to keep personnel related costs in check. I'll point out there are limited exceptions. We are all painfully aware of some of the vacancy and some of the challenges we've had with corrections. We are maintaining that flow as we have recruitment classes and things like that, but all other areas of the state, and certainly there are areas in health that we're concerned about, and even first responders and public safety. But then whenever we have some type of request or something, we take a look at that on a case-by-case basis. But the governor is very focused on trying to keep those expenses down while ensuring that those emergency services or urgent services that we have a backlog in that we can certainly address appropriately. And then the governor vetoed several new and increased mandates that passed during the shortened and your rushed legislative session. You all know about those. Yesterday's BPW reductions represented a minor but a necessary step in our plan to protect the state's finances. The administration's strategy here is to harness the general funds that had been set aside for capital projects that had not been spent nor allocated to specific projects or that are not needed at this time. And therefore, I guess the overriding question is no projects were canceled. And these were strictly programs that came through PAYGO. And the unallocated funding will help us cover our known FY20 shortfall. Our grand total recognizes that more than $120 million in general fund agency reductions, including the 2 reductions that David had referenced from the dedicated purpose account amounting to $97 million. While he touched on the WMATA portion of that, the other 2 portions, they're $31 million for 2 separate projects. One is the Southern Maryland project that the university system has. That one is progressing along well. They don't have any impediments in finding contractors and all, and we will move forward with that as we submit the 22 capital budget. And even if there is some type of catastrophe later on in our finances, the university system has been made aware of it. We might have to dip in there until the state can backfill that, but the governor has a commitment to that. The other one is the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. A lot of you are aware of the trying to do with the pharmacy program school that's going on there. They have cash flow challenges, which is okay in this context, which just means we can successfully defer some of that until they find the contractors that are willing and able to do the work down below Salisbury. And that's what I'm advised is their challenge there. But we also have a commitment to make sure that comes to fruition, and we'll move forward with that. There was a $7 million reduction to the Department of Planning and their Heritage Structure Rehabilitation Tax Credit. We put $9 million into that every year. There's a 3-year lag, at least when the projects might be committed to. And for those of us that were around for a long time, that was the Rehabilitation Tax Credit that we've had for years and years. And we understand when the secretary came to us on that I think Mark might correct me on the technical number, there was about $37 or $38 million spoken for, and this is over and above that. So we have sufficient resources there until even the 21 monies come in to handle any outstanding obligations to keep those projects moving forward. And then a $6.7 million reduction to the Department of Education's capital grant program. Again, these were projects that they just don't have identified on the safety side. We can incorporate those as we move forward, and there is money set aside in the 21 budget to pick up on some of those. We only wanted to identify projects that weren't going to be spoken for or utilized in the current fiscal year. So those were the easiest actions for us to stomach. There are going to be future actions, and we really don't know the magnitude or exactly where they're going to rest, but we just know they're going to require a lot of courage in going forward. So in spite of the progress we've made, we have a long way to go, and the path is not clear. As David showed you in that slide 10, we don't know what the federal government's monies are going to look like, much less timing. The timing on when that could come through can certainly dictate some actions in what we do. From a budgetary point of view, it is easiest or easier and best to have them make some reductions or identified early on so that they don't start some program and then have to pull back. Again, we're just trying to see what the 20 closeout is before we can even identify options as we might move forward. We're committed to do whatever's necessary to provide the essential government services and make sure that the state and our citizenry are on a glide path to recovery. But again, we don't even know what that glide slope looks like in terms of length. The state's ability to weather this storm is dependent on our willingness to make some difficult decisions and sacrifice where we can. And no one, no agency, no department can be held exempt from any of these actions or decisions. And I think I've heard from one or two secretaries where they see it as an opportunity to really get down into the weeds and identify this program is critical and we really need to keep the resources to it. Something else might be on the margins, therefore they have to allocate the resources to make sure that can move forward. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear in front of your committee and in front of everybody here. Again, Mark and I are prepared to take any questions that you might have. I'm surprised no one else has their camel hair on today. It's Thursday.
It is Thursday. We should be. We'll keep that in mind for next time. And we do very much appreciate you being with us today. Let me, I'll wait as people might put their hands up. But I wanted to ask you maybe a little more insight on what you're thinking. I mean, I think this is a realistic problem. We can make an argument both ways of whether you give sort of the big picture of cuts earlier on, or if you wait to hear more about the federal government. Are you thinking, we have feedback here, unfortunately.
Yeah, here too.
Could you talk a little bit more about what your thinking is? I also heard you say you wanted to wait until you sort of close out 20 to get a picture. But I didn't know if you meant really close out 20 as in August before making that, or if you were referring to sort of just getting towards the end of the year. I know obviously Board of Public Works meets every 2 weeks. Can you give us a better sense of when you might be making some additional cuts to 21, or the first round of cuts, I guess, to 21? And again, just a little bit, maybe more insight on philosophically where you stand on the sort of wait or move on the big picture.
Yeah, it's entirely probable that we'll see a couple different waves. And when I say we're looking for the closeout, I don't mean in August on 20. What I mean more specifically is we're looking to see what the numbers come in with May, because that will dictate what, if any, we need to take from the rainy day fund. That will then dictate what the starting balance would be on 21. Those would be some of the starting points. And what we will do, probably along the lines of what DLS does for you, is prepare several different options. But at what point in time those come up for consideration or decision, might even be spread out over a period of time. But we will create some ideas. So when I say we're looking for the closeout, I don't mean the absolute or the technical closeout. We need to see what May's numbers are going to be, what the impacts are going to be. And I'll point out that for instance, the things that we've gotten from the federal government just in the past week went to this thing that David had talked about, which was we now are told that we can count. David, you're here. Mark's here. I think it's all the public safety expenses and healthcare expenses that we had dealing with the health departments and also some of the law enforcement challenges like that. We might, Mark, when I think he advised me that we might be able to wrap into that our correctional expenses that we had with that. Well, that goes back to March 1st. If we can count that on some of the federal monies coming in, that's a big boost. And therefore, that helps us in making some recommendations to BPW. And those decisions just came in a few weeks ago. David referenced the other aspect that we have interpretation that we can use some of the CARES Act money to do some of the matching funds that we had been preparing to fork up. So Washington vacillating like it's doing. Now, I acknowledge it's also trying to react to what all the states are looking for and act on. So far, it's been helpful because they've said, we're going to step in and fill this gap. But we don't know, that's going to continue. We don't know when that's going to happen. We might lay something on the table for consideration. There might be a deferral or an acceptance of it. but then find that the federal government in October, November might come back on us. We're trying to just get some sense of direction on where we can take some of that. And Mark, you want to chime in with anything else? Because I know that we had those 2 issues this week, and I don't even know if he has technical. There he is.
Sure,
I didn't see
Secretary.
you on my screen.
Yes, as the Secretary mentioned, the federal government has given us some good news in the last couple of weeks. The first one went around the presumption that certain public safety costs are allowable or presumed allowable. So obviously what the administration plans to do is sort of calculate the costs of the Maryland State Police, their salaries in the fourth quarter of this year. And we will cover those with the federal funds to help us balance. Where the guidance is a little unclear still is with regards to corrections. We've had a number of discussions with the United States Treasury as to whether or not correctional officer salaries would count. Right now, it seems to still be unclear. They have made a presumption, though, around local health costs, so public health, local health. The administration's plan is to use a little bit of the federal funds to make the fourth quarter payment to the local health departments rather than general funds. Both of those actions, along with some of the response pay, we think will save the state about $50 million in the current fiscal year. And finally, as the Secretary mentioned, this week, the administration announced that the Coronavirus Relief Fund will be eligible as a match for federal disaster relief funds. That will make additional funding available to the state to address the cost of the pandemic. And to the extent that the federal government guidance becomes even clearer, I think the administration's plan would be to shift as much or as much as of the cost of the response to the pandemic to disaster relief, and then try to use the more flexible funds from the Coronavirus Relief Fund to help us with budgetary challenges or meeting other expenses that are not eligible under disaster relief.
So I hope that was helpful, because again, I'll get an email from Mark at 10 o'clock at night. This is what we just learned on the call today. I will give my deputy a shout out. He is I think he was recently elevated because of a retirement or a resignation or something. Mark, what are you, the executive director? You're the chairman of the National Association of State Budget Officers. So he's involved in their conversations with the National Governors Association and the White House. So we tend to get some rather immediate information or intel. And actually, even Mark has brought up that this thing is not quite clear and we have to figure out how to navigate it. And it's just been a great resource. And I want to acknowledge him as being, I think it's been very helpful. And I'll also point out that he's in regular conversations. I try to join the calls periodically with DLS staff so we can all compare notes on what we're finding out or learning or intel that might be out there for what we're looking for from Washington. Because right now, that's just been so critical to what we're looking to do.
Well, congratulations from us also, Mr. McCall. That's great.
Thank
you. One quick question from me, Mr. Secretary. So obviously in the CARES Act, there's lots of different specified programs that get money, and then there's the broader sort of more flexible money. When can we expect budget amendments bringing that money into the state?
We're preparing some now in light of the actions from BPW yesterday. So you should have, I don't know what the timing is on when they'll land on your desk. So you'll start to see some of those. And I think, Mark, if I'm not mistaken, we've already prepared a few others based on some actions going on up there. But I have John Martin has been assigned to the work group with Department of Health, and then also with procurement. We created a special team, which is to get together 3 times a week to deal with these things in an expedited manner. Now, that's not so much to run things through the door. It is to ensure that supplies and procurement challenges and all that stuff can make sure that MDH has the resources that it needs. So Mark, can you give an update on what we're looking at from the amendment point of view?
Sure. I would expect, as the secretary said, we will be processing the Board of Public Works amendment, later this week, early next week. There are some budget amendments that are beginning to flow through the process, and as we move into the next 2 to 3 weeks, I presume you will be seeing many of the additional budget amendments coming through, reallocating costs out to specific agencies. For instance, as David Romans mentioned, the administration's plan is it was originally to use the rainy day fund for the business loan programs. We believe that is an eligible expense under the coronavirus relief fund. So we would be processing an amendment, sending that money back to the rainy day fund and using the coronavirus relief fund for the business loan and grant programs in commerce and in labor. So you should be seeing that shortly too.
Great, thank you. All right, Senator McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Brinkley, first, just thank you for the presentation, and I hope that you and your family are well and safe. Yes, sir. There were a number of cuts being proposed to the Board of Public Works, specifically burning and strategic demolition. Could you elaborate on the thoughts, the systems rubric that you all put into making those decisions? Specifically, what goes into one program versus another to be suggested to be cut?
Yeah, we had the conversations with the secretaries and our capital team also, which basically, as you recall, Bernie took, in some instances, several projects. I think it was like an 18-month delay where we had funding set aside. By the time the projects came to fruition, by the time there were contracts and all that stuff, so there was a delay initially. Then they started processing things through. Some projects were moving on. Some demolition was taking place. And when we had the conversations with the team, the question posed was, we know there's going to be, potentially more money coming in on the 21 side. What do we have available that has not been spoken for in 21? This is the dollar amount that came about from that. Again, our mission is not to touch the program per se. Our mission is to get to the finish line, find out what we had to clear out, because we have no idea exactly what we're going to see from the federal government. Similarly with the schools program, is what monies had not been spoken for or allocated. No one wants to do away with any projects that deal with school safety and that aren't being done. But when they had money that had not been spent or not allocated, that was something that we saw that we could move forward with in this regard. And then 21 starts the conversation all over again. And there are some valid concerns there, but what we had identified here with the oversight team members that we have was cash that was potentially sitting idle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I got to tell you, I'm impressed with that picture because your lips never moved while you asked the question. Right there on the screen. So.
Senator McCray has many skills. Senator Zucker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, always good to see you. Wish it was under better circumstances, but Senator McCray's question was kind of in line with mine. Based on the Board of Public Works actions, what, if anything, is being done to reach out to the community colleges or, the school safety grant programs went to a lot of your independent learning different schools to help them with upgrades? Normally they're pretty delayed and when they're putting in the applications for the fiscal year we're in. So I'm just wondering, based on the Board of Public Works action, what, if anything, is being done to reach out to the community colleges and other beneficiaries to let them know about the actions? Thank you.
Well, again, the community college portion of this is, you all had recently added language from the general fund. We had to provide certain maintenance upgrades and all that. They utilized the vast majority of that, but all we harvested here were the monies that had not been allocated. So as any time with a new program, there might be a certain ramp up that has to take place. But with 6 weeks left to go in the fiscal year, and that money had not seen an application or much less been allocated to it, we saw it as harvestable. And I'll remind you that the new year starts up in 6 weeks. There has been money allocated along those lines, and it's just incumbent on them to make sure that they get their application of work, and so that we can all scrutinize it. There's a process involved, and I think for the most part, I didn't have a conversation with them, but I think they understand that. And as with anything, with getting something stepped up, we'll just have to see how things go. Our whole paradigm, our whole way of doing business is shifting, and I think a lot of people are going to see some new priorities moving forward. So.
Okay, thank you. Senator Serafini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone. One comment and then a question, I guess. So first one is, I'll fall into the Andy Schaffel fan club. I have been for a long time. And, I'm saddened. He's not going away. We're going to find him. He's left his email in there. But I think we need to think about that in the future. I think we need to, we stepped up for the chief investment officer to say, there's certain key positions in the state that we can't lose in the future. We pay our coaches a lot of money, and I would say what Andy Schaffel has done for our state with BRE is something that's invaluable. I begged and pleaded, and so did the treasurer last week, for him not to go, but God bless him. But we need to think about why is that, and how do we ensure the next Andy Schaffel can't leave. I'm not talking about, shackling into his desk at the office, but we should think about that. My question.
Come on, others have thought of that, so
yes. Oh, yeah, I did. We're out my knees on the ground begging him to stay. So, and I really do appreciate him as a person and what he's done for our state. I guess I'm asking any of the three presenters today. We just talked about how we're going to cut millions and hundreds of millions, but those figures are billions. And I think Secretary Brinkley said it well. We're pretty trim. We're getting complaints that we're understaffed in state agencies. So when we when we talk about the vegetables that we're going to have to eat, even we don't like them, those hard decisions, it's not just that they're going to be hard, they're going to be really big as far as it looks like. And sooner or later, the government cannot take the place of commerce. And I know that's the struggle we're all having in our communities about getting back to work. But, how do we talk about, we've cut billions before in out year projections, but within 2 years, how do we find 4 billion if we need to? Just curious if we can start thinking about, how dire, so we can have real conversations. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that up? Or
Yeah, I was just not sure anybody wants that.
Well, I'll just point out something that when I was on Senate Budget and Tax, no one pointed this out to me, and I didn't learn it until I was a budget secretary. And it goes into an area that can be pretty dicey. But the fact is, you've heard me say this before, but here is where it comes to roost. 42% of the state's general fund budget is given away to other levels of government. No other level of government, absent the federal government right now is the crisis, and you see how we're looking to see exactly what they're sending. No other level of government has that obligation or responsibility. And therefore, all your decisions are going to be left in that category, which is the balance of that, the 58%. And we have some constitutional obligations to the bondholders. We're going to make sure that happens. Maybe not necessarily from the general fund, but we also have obligations that are pension obligations that are a part and parcel of that. And then a lot of other services that have to be delivered. And you can say that as an interesting factoid, but until we get down to actually taking actions, this is where we're squeezed by having those parameters.
Okay. Senator Roosevelt.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say to the Secretary in particular, I think the approach that you all are taking is very prudent and very thoughtful in terms of dealing with the FY20 issues and going slow on trying to figure some of this stuff out because there are so many uncertainties. So I just want to say that up front. I'm not surprised, but I'm still impressed. The question I want to ask relates more to the short and medium term in terms of the federal money I guess the rainy day fund too, because in a way, the unallocated federal money, the 1.3 billion, and the rainy day fund are sort of the most fungible resources with each other for dealing with the short-term issues. It seems as though people pretty much agree now that to get the economic recovery going faster rather than slower, we need to move to ubiquitous testing, tracing, and quarantining, because right now the economy is shut down in large part because we haven't had those, and so we've had to shut down and have lots of people stay home who don't need to stay home. Lots of people don't not to go to work because we don't know who has the virus, and so there seems to be a consensus now that we need to get to a very high level of testing, tracing, and selected isolation by folks who need to be isolated. Has the administration, from a budget point of view, identified how much money you all think we need to spend, let's say, over the next 9 months, maybe a year, whatever it may be? I think the Moody's assessment is no vaccine until the fall of 2021. How much money we need to be allocating to the testing, tracing, and isolation so that we can restart the economy the way we want to?
Okay, now I hit the unmute button. To my knowledge, the direct answer is right now we're just trying to make sure that we have some of the protective equipment out. I do know that they're entering into conversations, and I think they even have a contract to do the extended contact tracing, because that's only a part of it. The ongoing testing, how, when, where, and all that still remains to be seen. I don't have a direct knowledge of a number that's been quantified on it. But similarly, even if we did, you have to wonder if it's valid because things are happening and changing and adjusting so quickly. Right now, we have to find out from the professionals what is it that they need and then try to make some adaptations. I'll give you an example of something I heard in a conversation with the county executive here, my county executive, Jan Gardner in Frederick County, which I thought was brilliant. I haven't heard of anybody else doing it. They probably are, because they certainly share information, which is while the schools were shut down, the school health resource personnel, nurses and health practitioners that were in there, they were still having to pay them, but they reassigned them to contact tracing. Right. And it's a great utilization of that resource. Someone who's already educated, certainly has had some type of involvement. I see Senator Eckerd, nodding her head to that effect. And that was just something that came at the local level. Now, whether the other 23 jurisdictions are doing something like it or similar to it, I don't know. Someone reached out by email, I think today or last night, had something that, or maybe it was a news story that I saw about having librarians do some type of contact tracing along those lines. So right now, our mission is to have the conversations of what is it the health professionals are saying we need, and that's responsive in Maryland. Senator Edwards here, District 1, their needs are different than certainly everybody who represents Prince George's County on the screen. And perhaps they're more immediate down in the Prince George's County area. I can tell you that the nursing home in Carroll County, where 25% of the residents died, is less than a half a mile from my house up here, and really skewed a lot of the numbers along those lines. Right now, the biggest challenge is taking the bureaucracy that we all have, which is the state government, and ensuring that it's responsive and reactive properly so. So to extrapolate numbers out to the spring or something like that, maybe someone else is having that conversation and hasn't come to my level at this point in time. Right now, our mission is to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And that's one of the things I have to get out of the way of. I know where my limitations are. Mark, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. He's trying to find his unmute button too. So.
I think the secretary covered it.
Mr. Chairman.
I never had that question before.
Mr. Chairman, are you there?
He's talking. Now I'm unmuted. Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to do a follow-up with the secretary, if I might.
Sure.
I must say I'm a little surprised by your answer for a couple of reasons. One is because, again, the health experts that we all listen to, talk to here publicly, talk about how testing and tracing have been the keys to getting the pandemic under control in other countries. And one of the big reasons the United States has had the tragedies that we've had is because the United States, and frankly, Maryland, were so slow in getting testing and tracing up to the scale it needed to be. So it doesn't seem to me there's much controversy among the health people about this, number one. Number two is, as you know, the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House sent a letter to the governor last week specifically asking for a plan with numbers and metrics and budget numbers around it. So have you not seen that letter, or there literally has been no discussion within the administration about planning to do the level of testing and tracing we need to restart the economy?
I've seen the letter that as it came through, and I can point out that that wasn't really the question that you asked me up front. You asked me what the costs were going to be out in some of the out months. And what I was trying to get to you was the fact that all we're trying to do is also move heaven and earth to ensure that some of the facilities are up and operational so that we deal with any type of short-term impact. Specifically, the hospitals that had been reopened in Prince George's County. We have a facility going up and online now in Hagerstown to deal with anything through the corrections side. That's one of the high points, as I understand it, in that Maryland has not had some of the problems that other states have seen, particularly the federal correctional system. And so as we're trying to deal with the short-term aspect, but we also know that the contact tracing is critical. So is the testing. And we've all heard and focused also on the supply chain. So there's going to be an awful lot that has to be woven in together on some of that. And we've been certainly focusing on getting the hospitals and everything else up and running. And those conversations are taking place. I'm not involved at that level. I did see the letter that came through, and I'm aware of the conflict going on with the information and the conversation back and forth with MDH.
Well, if I may just leave it here, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary, I think it would be very good for the people of Maryland, particularly the working people of Maryland, the small business people in Maryland, if the administration, were the health department, the budget department, to get together and come up with a plan to get the level of public safety and public health testing and tracing that we need to be able to really robustly get the economy going again. Thank you very much.
No one can disagree with that statement.
Thank you.
I do not see anyone else with their hand up. Anybody? Last call for any of the three presenters today. Okay. All right. Well, so thank you, Mr. Schoffel, Mr. Romans, Secretary Brinkley, Mr. Nicole. Congratulations again to you. And we are very grateful for the time you spent with us today. It's really helpful. I thought it was a great briefing, and we're getting a better sense of all the pieces as they come together, as we all are struggling with thinking about and working towards good solutions for the citizens of Maryland. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the committee members. We had all the committee on here. Very grateful that the full committee took the time, and we will be in touch, of course. Have a great day, everyone.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.